Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moffman coming back at you with another APUSH video. We're continuing our tour through the Cold War in topic 8.2. Previously we looked at the Eisenhower years in the Cold War, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Kennedy years. And even though Kennedy will only be president for 2.5 years, his time in office is going to be critical in the history of the Cold War, and arguably the most dangerous phase of the Cold War. But the challenges that Kennedy is going to be facing during the Cold War is actually going to be predated before he becomes president. And that's because of what's going to be happening with one of our close neighbors, and that is Cuba. We always are going to have an interest in what is happening politically in Cuba because it is one of our closest neighbors, just 90 miles south of the Florida Keys. And of course, our history with Cuba has been, well, complicated to say the least. Liberating Cuba from the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, but then turning them into a protectorate afterwards. As we get into the 1930s and 40s and 50s, we see America supporting autocratic regimes there that are very pro-American in terms of business, but tend to create this, nation where there is a tremendous gap between the uber wealthy and everybody else. And of course, a lot of this is going to be focusing in on government corruption. And when we get to 1959, this is going to come to a head when President Batista of Cuba will have his government overthrown by this fella right here. This is Fidel Castro. Castro is going to be successful in organizing poor peasant Cubans to take over the country. Now, at first, it really was not tied to communism. It was kind of seen as a people's rebellion or a people's revolt. And, it did not necessarily have a bad, taste to it, so to speak, from an American perspective. But it won't take too long before Castro starts to show his true colors and that he is, at the end of the day, a communist and becomes very, very chummy with the USSR. Now, this adds a whole new wrinkle to the Cold War because, remember, we have been committed to stopping the spread of communism. But the fight against communism has always been, up to this point, perceived as a fight far away. It's in Europe. It's in Asia. It's not really here. But now it is. Now we've got a communist regime right out our back door. And that creates even more tension and fear for the United States in its attempt to stop the global expansion of communism. So in response to Castro's regime taking over, we're going to see the U.S. at the tail end of the Eisenhower administration cut off trade with the new Cuban government. Now the question becomes, with Kennedy now coming into the White House, how will the U.S., affect this policy? Now obviously Kennedy is not, pro-communist at all, but we are going to see Kennedy show a willingness to kind of soften the rhetoric, at least in terms of policy, from the Eisenhower administration, which had previously been predicated on massive retaliation. Once again, the idea being of, if somebody from the Soviet Union attacks us or one of our allies, we will respond with a full complement of our nuclear weapons, a massive retaliation. But of course, as we said previously, the negative side of this, and it's a huge negative, is mutually assured destruction, basically nuclear global annihilation. So even though Kennedy is going to continue to see the production of nuclear weapons to the U.S., expand, and he's certainly not anti-nuke, but Kennedy is willing to look at other options beyond just nuclear, promoting what he calls a flexible response. So the idea being is that, depending on what the circumstances are, we may or may not respond with nuclear weapons, where the Eisenhower administration was mostly looking at nukes as the primary response policy. Kennedy is going to be, promoting the use of, more special forces that will begin to emerge, like the Rangers and the Green Berets and things like that. So basically, Kennedy wants a lot of options. And part of that is showing a willingness to use some of the creativity coming from the newly created CIA in the previous decade. And something that the CIA had concocted at the end of the Eisenhower administration, but Ike was a little bit nervous to put into motion, was something that's going to be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, if you go back to the map of our neck of the woods, when Castro comes to power, you're going to see thousands and thousands and thousands of Cuban refugees leave the island and head towards southern Florida, many of them moving into the Miami area. Now, these were folks that may not necessarily have been, buddies with Batista, the previous dictator, though some were. Some certainly got their bread buttered from that previous regime. Most of these folks are running away because they absolutely fear or hate communism and everything that comes along with it. And this was certainly the case in Cuba. Castro is going to be having an authoritarian regime, secret police, no protection for civil liberties, all that kind of stuff you would see in China, North Korea, Soviet Union, Poland, whatever at the time. So you've got this group of Cuban refugees now in southeastern Florida that, more than anything else, want to take back the island, take back control, and kick out Castro and the communists. The CIA knows this. And so the idea being is, to achieve our goals of eradicating communism from Cuba, seemingly a better option than sending American bombers into Cuba and American ships to Cuba, which would likely necessitate a major global war, the CIA thinks of something more, clandestine. The plan was to take these Cuban refugees, train them up in military tactics, give them weapons, so in order to give them the resources to travel back to Cuba and start an armed insurrection to kick out Castro and take back the island. The CIA is very confident about this. They think this is the best plan to achieve our goals. However, when it is put into implementation, when Kennedy gives the green light, it is an absolute disaster. When these Cuban refugees show up at the Bay of Pigs, which is why this gets its name, they are easily caught by Castro's forces. Many of them are killed right on the beach, the vast majority easily captured. And obviously, Castro is not stupid. He doesn't realize, or he doesn't, believe that this is just some renegade group of Cubans that just on their own show up with, military grade weapons and training. He knows darn well the U.S. is behind this, which is true, even though the U.S. denies it. This is going to be a major embarrassment for Kennedy, a major embarrassment for the United States, and it fuels much more paranoia for Castro and puts him much closer in bed with Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, and that's going to lead to more challenges. But before we get to that new added wrinkle, we got to get back to Europe. Understand that by the early 1960s, we know that Berlin was still divided, east and west, and even though Stalin had attempted back in the late 40s to choke off West Berlin, it proved to be unsuccessful. But there's still a continuing problem of folks in East Berlin trying to sneak to the West, and it's a clearly, an embarrassment for the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev decides to take it to the next level and construct an actual physical barrier all the way around the perimeter of West Berlin. And so the idea is to keep everyone else out of West Berlin and therefore lock out the influence West Berlin may have on the rest of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe. This Berlin Wall is going to serve to not just physically divide a city and physically divide families. It's going to be a physical representation of the Iron Curtain itself. And for the remainder of the Cold War, as long as that construction is up and functional, and soldiers are at the border, and the barbed wire is there and showing a willingness to shoot to kill anyone simply trying to get to freedom in West Berlin, this is going to show the evils associated with communism during the Cold War. So this is another knock against Kennedy. This has happened, and it doesn't seem like Kennedy can do anything about it. But going back to Cuba, remember, when the Bay of Pigs fails spectacularly, Castro is going to learn a lesson from this. He knows that the U.S. is not going to simply stop trying to take him out as the leader of Cuba and, try to get rid of communism. So if you're Castro, you're going to go to your most powerful ally you can think of, and that is the Soviet Union, and you are going to try to get the best defensive weapons that you could get. And that, of course, would be nuclear weapons. We will start to see the Soviet Union secretly begin to ship, items to help construct nuclear missile sites on the island of Cuba. But in the fall of 1962, American spy planes flying over the island will begin to find this out. So it's no longer a secret. And when it becomes clear that the Soviets are beginning to set up nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba, Kennedy goes to the American people and apprises the American people on the new dangers that this presents. Because let's think about this. It's one thing to have nukes in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and maybe even China, but it's another thing to have nukes right in your backyard. Nuclear weapons fired from Cuba could be detonated in the United States before the U.S. has the ability to retaliate. And that is unacceptable for Kennedy and the United States government. But all the while, the Soviets are continuing to ship nuclear weapons to the island. And in fact, another big shipment is headed to the island. We cannot abide this. This cannot be allowed to happen. But once again, we can't roll tanks in. We can't, firebomb the island, risking a nuclear war. So the Kennedy administration has to get creative. The solution, according to Kennedy, is to implement a naval blockade around the island. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. And so, as the Soviet supply ships are heading towards Cuba, the world will collectively hold its breath during what we will call the Cuban Missile Crisis. Basically 2 weeks where we're going to be seeing the world wonder what is going to happen when these Soviet ships show up at the island of Cuba, when they show up to the blockade line. If these Soviet ships show up and the United States just lets them go, then we have surrendered nukes to the Cubans, and we will now be under, the Cuban gun forever. If the Soviet ships attempt to go through the blockade and we try to stop them by firing on them, will this then lead to a Soviet nuclear response, instigating a nuclear war? This is a very real possibility. Americans are thinking that the world may not last too many days longer. And for many folks, this is the most dangerous phase in the entire history of the Cold War. This is going to be a battle of wills, and it's going to be really who's going to blink first, the U.S. or the Soviets. At the end of the day, it will be the Soviets. As we see those Soviet transport ships head towards the island, we're going to be seeing backdoor negotiations go on that will lead to the Soviets turning around at the moment of truth. Kennedy gets unbelievable acclaim for this. The Soviets look like they have blinked, like the U.S. has won the day. But understand, this is really just part of a bigger deal. When the Soviets agree to not put nukes in Cuba, behind the scenes, the U.S. agrees to remove already pre-existing missiles that were in Turkey pointed towards the Soviet Union. But nonetheless, peace prevails, at least in this incident. And because we come so darn close to nuclear Armageddon, the result of this crisis will lead to a couple of things. One, the creation of the hotline, which will allow for a direct phone connection from the Oval Office in the White House to the innermost sanctum of the Kremlin, where the Soviet premier is, being able to directly communicate to avoid some sort of mistake that starts a nuclear war. We also are going to see a ban on nuclear testing between the two countries in the 1963 treaty. So the Kennedy years, though short, are going to lead to some very, very, very challenging times in the history of the Cold War. We'll see you next time.